There's something haunting about an old doorway, a threshold that has witnessed centuries pass, its stones bearing the weight of untold stories. Picture this: you're standing in front of a massive, weather-beaten archway, its surface etched with symbols you can't decipher, and a cold breeze whispers through the cracks like a voice from the past. These aren't just doors, they're silent sentinels guarding secrets of stone, salt, and silence, elements that shaped Europe's hidden history in ways most of us have never considered. From remote monasteries to abandoned salt mines, these enigmatic portals were more than mere entrances. They were boundaries between the known and the unknown, the sacred and the forbidden. What if I told you that behind some of these doorways lay rituals so strange, so deeply veiled in mystery, that even historians struggle to unravel them? Think of the monks who carved their prayers into stone, their voices long gone but their marks enduring, or the miners who descended into darkness, their livelihoods buried deep beneath the earth, where salt was as precious as gold. These doorways weren't just functional, they were symbolic, often representing transitions between worlds, both physical and spiritual. Some were built to keep people out, while others seemed designed to lure the curious in, their very presence an invitation to step into the unknown. So why do these ancient thresholds still captivate us today? Perhaps it's because they remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the human stories etched into the very fabric of these places. The silence surrounding them isn't empty, it's heavy with meaning, waiting for someone to listen. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk through these doorways together, uncovering the legends they hold, the mysteries they conceal, and the eerie sense that, even now, they haven't given up all their secrets. This isn't just a journey through stone and shadow, it's a chance to hear the whispers of the past, if you're willing to lean in and listen. Stone was never just a building material in the medieval world, it was a living canvas, chosen with intention and reverence. Picture the massive lintels above these doorways, some weighing as much as a dozen men, hauled into place not just to impress, but to invoke awe. The same rugged cliffs that shaped Europe's landscapes became sacred thresholds, their veins of quartz or flecks of mica catching the light like celestial signals. In Ireland, doorways were framed with speckled granite believed to hold the voices of ancestors, while in France, the pale limestone of Chartres was said to hum with divine resonance when struck. But the true magic lies in how these stones were placed. Many portals align precisely with the sunrise on feast days, so light would pierce the doorway like a blessing. Others face sacred mountains or rivers, turning geography into a kind of silent prayer. And then there are the markings, those cryptic symbols chiseled into the surface. A spiral might represent the cycle of life, while a series of dots could map the stars as they appeared on the night the door was consecrated. Some craftsmen even pressed their hands into wet mortar, leaving behind fingerprints as personal as a signature. What's haunting is how much we've forgotten. The language of these stones, the reason one type was chosen over another, the rituals performed as they were set into place, has faded like the inscriptions themselves. Yet their power remains, even today, running a hand over these weathered surfaces. You can feel the weight of centuries, the stubborn insistence of stone to outlast memory. It's no wonder so many legends speak of doorways that open only under a full moon, or stones that weep when touched. These were never just entrances, they were thresholds between the earthly and the eternal, built by hands that believed in both. Salt wasn't just sprinkled on food in medieval Europe, it was woven into the very foundation of society, as vital as coinage and as sacred as holy water. Imagine a world where a sack of this crystalline treasure could buy land, pay soldiers, or even secure a bride's dowry. That's the power it held. The doorways we see today, half buried in hillsides or hidden beneath monasteries, often guard the echoes of this salt trade. Step through one, and you're walking the same path as miners who lit their way with flickering tallow lamps, their backs bent under the weight of blocks so precious, thieves risked death to steal them. Some of these passages were designed to confuse. Take the twisting tunnels of Hallstatt, Austria, where doorways were built at odd angles to disorient anyone who didn't know the route. Others, like those in Poland's Wielicka mine, were framed with elaborate carvings, saints and demons locked in eternal struggle, a warning to those who might take more than their share. But salt's magic went deeper than commerce. It was scattered across thresholds to ward off evil spirits, mixed into mortar to purify sacred spaces, even tucked into the corners of cradles to protect newborns. In a time when people believed the devil couldn't cross a line of salt, a doorway lined with it became more than wood and iron. It was a barrier between safety and chaos. The Salzburg mines tell a chilling tale. Miners there whispered of a door no one dared open, its hinges crusted with salt and marked with a sigil resembling a twisted cross. Behind it, legend claimed, lay a chamber where the earth itself groaned. Was it superstition? Perhaps. But when archaeologists found child-sized footprints preserved in salt deep within those tunnels, centuries old and leading nowhere, even skeptics paused. These weren't just workplaces, they were liminal spaces where the physical and spiritual worlds blurred. Today, if you press your palm against the damp walls of an old salt mine doorway, you might still feel it, the faint, granular residue of history. It clings like memory, a reminder that these portals weren't just about what passed through them, but what they kept out. Salt preserved meat, yes, but it also preserved something far more fragile. The belief that a door could be a boundary against the unknown, its very grains a spell written in crystals. Silence in medieval Europe wasn't empty, it was alive, a presence thicker than stone and more potent than prayer. Walk through one of these doorways into a monastery's cloister, and you'd feel it immediately, the way sound seemed to dissolve the moment you crossed the threshold. The architects knew this. They designed hallways with curved ceilings to swallow echoes, laid straw underfoot to muffle footsteps, and positioned doors at angles that disrupted even the faintest murmur. These weren't just practical choices, they were spiritual ones. In places like the Certosa di Pavia in Italy, silence was so sacred that monks communicated through a complex language of hand gestures, their fingers weaving words in the air like invisible ink. Some doorways led to spaces where silence wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced with an almost physical weight. Beneath the Abbey of Saint Victor in Marseille, a low, narrow passage opens into a cell barely wider than a man's shoulders. Here, penitents would kneel for hours, their breath the only sound, the walls pressing in until the boundary between their thoughts and the silence blurred. Others, like the hermitages carved into the cliffs of Meteora, Greece, had doors that opened onto sheer drops, a visceral reminder that true quiet demanded surrender to the wind, to the void, to something beyond human noise. But the most haunting silences were the intentional ones. In the crypt of Rosslyn Chapel, a hidden doorway conceals a chamber where a single chair faces a blank wall. Local legends claim that certain monks would sit there for years, their silence accumulating like dust until they could hear the voice of the stones. Whether metaphor or miracle, the idea persists. Silence wasn't just the absence of sound, but a kind of listening. Even now, if you stand in these spaces long enough, you might notice it, the way the air feels heavier, as if the walls absorbed every unspoken confession, every stifled gasp, and held them close. What's left today is a paradox. These doorways, built to preserve silence, now draw crowds of whispering tourists. Yet in rare moments when the last visitor leaves, when the light slants just so something lingers. A hush so deep it feels less like nothing and more like waiting. Perhaps that was the true purpose of these thresholds, not to keep silence in, but to remind us that some truths can't be spoken aloud. They can only be felt, pressing against your skin like the cool touch of ancient stone. The concept of a doorway as a threshold between worlds wasn't just superstition, it was woven into the very architecture of medieval life. Builders didn't merely construct these portals, they consecrated them, marking lintels with protective symbols or burying charms beneath the threshold to ward off unseen forces. Take the carved oak door of Notre Dame de Paris. Its surface dense with foliage and grotesques, not just decoration, but a visual spell to trap malevolent spirits in the tangled stone vines before they could cross into the sacred space. Even the act of stepping over the threshold had ritual significance. In parts of rural Germany, brides were once carried across doorways to confuse demons who might follow, while in Ireland, farmers drove livestock through decorated arches on Beltane to purify them before summer grazing. Some doorways seem to defy logic entirely. The so-called Devil's Door in England's Longthorpe Tower opens onto a sheer drop, leading nowhere. A deliberate design, some say, was meant to give evil spirits an exit they couldn't return through. Then there are the holy holes, small apertures found in churches like St. Helens in Essex, where pilgrims could crawl through to symbolically shed their sins before entering. But the most chilling tales surround doorways that refuse to stay sealed. In the Czech village of Hostom, locals tell of a cellar door that reappears every generation, no matter how many times it's walled up. Those brave enough to peer through claim to see a moonlit field where figures in outdated clothing wander, unaware they're being watched. What makes these stories linger isn't just their strangeness, but the grain of truth beneath. Archaeologists have found sealed doorways with odd deposits, animal bones, rusted keys, even tiny shoes hidden in their frames, suggesting people genuinely believed these thresholds needed guarding. And perhaps they did. In a world where the boundary between life and death, sacred and profane, was paper thin, a doorway wasn't just wood and iron. It was a negotiated border with the unknown, a place where the rules of reality softened just enough to let the unimaginable slip through. That's why even now, centuries later, we hesitate at certain thresholds, feeling the old instinct to knock or hold our breath, not out of habit, but because some part of us still believes. Monastic doorways were never just entrances, they were carefully crafted statements of faith and fortification. Take the Cistercian abbeys, where doors lacked exterior handles, a physical manifestation of their vow to shut out worldly distractions. To enter, you had to knock and wait, sometimes for hours, until a brother deemed you worthy of admittance. This wasn't mere architecture, it was theology carved in oak and iron. But some of these thresholds held even deeper secrets. At Mont Saint-Michel, a doorway hidden behind a seemingly ordinary bookshelf led to a clandestine scriptorium where illuminated manuscripts were copied by candlelight, their inks infused with crushed gemstones to catch the light like stained glass. The symbolism etched into these portals was just as deliberate as their construction. A serpent coiled around the doorframe at Cluny Abbey wasn't merely decoration, it was a visual parable, warning that knowledge without humility could corrupt. Other monasteries embedded crosses into their thresholds, forcing anyone who entered to literally step over Christ's symbol, a reminder of the sacrifices demanded within. And then there were the escape routes. Beneath the Abbey of St. Denis, a narrow staircase spirals down behind an unassuming door, emerging half a mile away in the cellar of a tavern. When Viking raiders stormed the coast, monks fled through this passage, carrying precious relics on their backs while chanting psalms to steady their nerves. Perhaps most intriguing are the doors that led nowhere, or at least nowhere visible. In Portugal's Alcobaça monastery, a small, unmarked doorway opens onto a sheer drop above the river. Historians debate its purpose. Was it a symbolic door to heaven for meditating monks, or a practical chute for disposing of spoiled ink and parchment? The answer may lie in the monastery's records, but here's the twist. Those very documents were hidden behind another secret door, this one disguised as a section of shelving in the library. Even today, conservators occasionally discover new compartments, their contents whispering of vows taken in shadows. What makes these monastic thresholds so compelling is their duality. They were barriers, yes, but also invitations to contemplation, to secrecy, to a life measured not in years but in prayers copied by quillite. Run your fingers along their grooves, and you'll feel more than wood grain. You'll trace the fingerprints of scribes who believed their work was a form of devotion, each stroke of the pen a step closer to the divine. These doors didn't just separate the sacred from the profane. They guarded the fragile boundary between memory and oblivion, ensuring that even in silence, the past would never fully close behind us. Castle doorways were never just grand entrances, they were psychological chess moves carved in stone. Walk through the towering gatehouse of a fortress like Dover or Carcassonne, and you're stepping into a carefully orchestrated game of power. Those imposing arches weren't just about defense, they were designed to humble. Visitors would crane their necks upward, dwarfed by the sheer scale, while archers watched from hidden slits above, a silent reminder of who held control. But the real mastery lay in the details. Notice how many castle doorways twist at odd angles, forcing invaders to expose their unshielded side or navigate narrow turns while laden with weapons. Even the flooring played tricks. At Warwick Castle, the threshold stones are deliberately uneven, a subtle tripping hazard that turned a dignified entrance into a stumblesome spectacle for unwelcome guests. Then there were the secrets woven into the walls, behind tapestries or beneath flagstones, concealed passages snaked through the stone-like veins. Some, like the spy tunnels in Château de Chinon, had whisper-thin gaps where lords could eavesdrop on courtiers below. Others served darker purposes. The oubliette, French for forgotten place, was often hidden behind an innocuous door, its pit dropping away to darkness where prisoners were left to vanish from memory. But not all hidden doorways were about cruelty. At Eilean Donan in Scotland, a disguised escape route winds down to the loch, its steps worn smooth by fleeing nobles during clan raids. These weren't just architectural quirks, they were lifelines in a world where survival depended on staying 3 moves ahead. The most chilling innovations were the ones that turned doorways into death traps. Murder holes, those innocuous-looking gaps in vaulted ceilings, could rain down anything from boiling pitch to quicklime on attackers below. At Crac des Chevaliers, a crusader stronghold in Syria, defenders diverted entire streams through hidden channels to flood stairwells, turning thresholds into sudden waterfalls. Even the hinges held secrets. Some castle doors swung outward to prevent invaders from ramming them down, while others had false locks designed to snap spears or break fingers. Every element was a calculated risk, a balance between hospitality and hostility. What's fascinating is how these designs trickled down into superstition. The habit of carrying brides over thresholds, it may have originated from nobles avoiding those uneven steps, the fear of whistling near doorways, possibly tied to the acoustic signals used by spies in hidden passages. These weren't just buildings, they were living puzzles, their doorways serving as both shield and sword. Today, when you run your hand along the iron-studded wood of a castle door, you're touching more than history. You're touching the fingerprints of architects who understood that the real power wasn't in the walls but in the spaces between them. There's a particular kind of doorway that sends a shiver down the spine, the kind where the wood seems to twist unnaturally, or the carvings appear just slightly off when glimpsed from the corner of your eye. These were the thresholds whispered about in village taverns, where stories of witches slipping through shadows turned architecture into armor against the unseen. Take Germany's Hexentor, those narrow, lopsided doors tucked into the sides of old cottages. Built deliberately small and crooked, they weren't just architectural quirks, they were traps. The logic was chillingly simple. If a witch tried to pass through, her unnatural bulk or the horns hidden beneath her hood would snag on the frame, exposing her before she could cross into the home. But the defenses didn't stop there. In the alpine villages of Switzerland, doorways were sometimes painted with a hidden witch's mark, a tiny, inverted pentagram or a twisted knotwork design meant to repel dark magic like a mirror turning back the evil eye. And then there were the witch stones. Across Italy and the Balkans, you'll find door frames studded with small, perfectly round holes no wider than a finger. These weren't decorative, they were drilled with painstaking precision to create a labyrinth for malicious spirits. Folklore claimed that a witch's curse, like smoke, would curl into these holes and become trapped, spiraling endlessly in the wood until it dissipated harmlessly. Some homes even buried animal skulls beneath the threshold, their hollow eye sockets facing upward to watch for approaching evil. The most haunting examples, though, are the doorways that seem to defy explanation entirely. In England's Dartmoor, a lone cottage doorway stands in the middle of a field, unconnected to any walls. Locals call it the Witch's Leap, and legend says it was built as a beacon for covens gathering under the new moon, a portal between worlds. Similar tales cling to the Devil's Doors of rural France, where certain farmhouse entrances were bricked up not for structural reasons, but because generations insisted that something else used them at night. Archaeologists have found remnants of these sealed thresholds, their stones blackened with soot from protective fires lit to cleanse them. What's striking isn't just the creativity of these defenses, but the raw fear they reveal. For medieval communities, evil wasn't an abstract concept, it was a breath against the back of your neck, a scrape of claws on the doorstep at midnight. These doorways were the front lines in a silent war, where every nail hammered and symbol carved was a desperate bid to keep the darkness at bay. Even now, when you press your palm against one of these weathered frames, you might swear you feel something, not just the grain of centuries-old wood, but the echo of a time when people truly believed that the right doorway could mean the difference between safety and ruin. Salt mine entrances were masterclasses in deception. What looked like a simple wooden shed or a fissure in a hillside could open into a labyrinth of crystalline corridors, some stretching deeper than the tallest cathedrals soared high. In Poland's Wieliczka mine, the doorway is almost humble, just a timber frame set into the earth. But step through, and you descend 700 steps into a world where miners turned salt into art, carving full-scale chapels with chandeliers that glitter not with glass but with compressed halite crystals. Every inch of these walls tells a story. Some are etched with saints, their robes flowing as if frozen mid-prayer. Others bear the faint, frantic scratches of canaries, the tiny miners who served as early warnings for toxic gas, their cages hung near doorways where fresh air might still reach them. The deeper you go, the stranger the beauty becomes. In Austria's Hallstatt mine, workers hollowed out an underground lake, its surface so still it mirrors the salt formations above like a submerged cathedral. But these weren't just feats of engineering, they were acts of devotion. miners risked their lives daily. Cave-ins, floods, and pockets of suffocating gas were constant threats. So they carved altars directly into the salt veins, lighting them with candles that made the walls shimmer like living stone. At Berchtesgaden in Germany, a tiny doorway leads to the Silent Night Chamber, where miners once gathered to sing carols by lamplight, their voices echoing through tunnels that had never seen the sun. Guarding these thresholds were rituals as precise as they were peculiar. In Transylvania, mine entrances were smeared with garlic paste to repel evil spirits, while Slovakian miners hung horseshoes over doorways, not upward for luck, but downward so the devil couldn't perch on them. Some sites, like the salt springs of Hallein, had speaking doors fitted with hollow tubes. Foremen would press an ear to them, listening for the telltale creaks of unstable rock. The salt itself was thought to have purifying powers. In alpine villages, midwives rubbed it on newborns' brows before passing them over the mine's threshold, a rite believed to grant lifelong protection. Yet for all their sacredness, these doorways also hid darker secrets. Beneath the Romanian town of Prade, a narrow passage opens into a gallery where the walls are studded with skeletal handprints. Miners who sealed themselves in during collapses, their final moments preserved in salt-bleached outlines. Other tunnels conceal ghost shifts, abandoned tools, and half-dug seams where workers simply vanished, swallowed by sudden rockfalls. The most haunting legend comes from Bochnia, where a doorway carved with a crude sun symbol was walled up after miners claimed to hear laughter echoing from behind it, laughter in a chamber no pickaxe had ever breached. What lingers today is the eerie duality of these spaces, the same doorways that welcomed pilgrims seeking the healing air of salt chambers also sealed away untold tragedies. Run your fingers along their frames, and you'll feel both the rough texture of toil and the smooth polish of reverence. These thresholds didn't just separate light from darkness. They straddled the line between survival and sanctity, where every step downward was a gamble that the earth would give up its treasures without claiming a life in exchange. The salt mines taught a brutal lesson. Beauty and peril shared the same doorway, and sometimes you couldn't have one without risking the other. Beneath the flickering candlelight of Europe's oldest churches, the crypt doorways seem almost to breathe, narrow slits in the stone, barely wide enough for a coffin to pass if turned on its side. This wasn't just practicality, it was theater of the most sacred kind. Imagine the pallbearers shuffling sideways, the deceased symbolically reborn as they crossed the threshold, entering eternity the same way they entered life, curled and vulnerable. In the crypt of St. Michel in Bordeaux, the door frames are worn smooth by centuries of this ritual, the stone polished by the shoulders of mourners and the edges of caskets. But the real intrigue lies in what's hidden beneath that wear. Look closer, and you'll find scratches, crisscrossed lines, concentric circles, even the occasional V-like symbol etched into the lintel. These weren't random marks, known as apotropaic signs. They were a kind of spiritual barbed wire, designed to trap restless souls trying to wander back into the world of the living. Paris's catacombs take this dialogue between the living and the dead a step further. Descend through that unassuming green door in the heart of the city, and you're greeted by an inscription that chills even in translation. Stop. This is the Empire of Death. Beyond it, 6 million skeletons line the tunnels, their skulls arranged in macabre patterns like a silent sermon. But the true genius lies in the doorways themselves, some arched like cathedral entrances, others low enough to force visitors into a bow. Each was a deliberate reminder mortality wasn't just a fact, it was a threshold everyone would cross, and these passages were dress rehearsals for that final journey. The silence in these spaces isn't accidental. In the ossuary beneath Rome's Santa Maria della Concesini, the bones of 4,000 Capuchin monks form elaborate mosaics. yet the only sound is the occasional drip of water echoing through the hollows of a skull. This hush was cultivated. Medieval caretakers would scatter quicklime on the floors, not just to hasten decomposition, but to muffle the footsteps of the living, preserving the illusion that the dead were truly at rest. Some crypts, like those in Prague's Sedlec Abbey, took it further. Their doorways were built with resonance chambers above them, designed to amplify even a whisper into a ghostly murmur, ensuring visitors kept their voices low. But not all thresholds stayed sealed. In England's St. Leonard's Church, a tiny doorway in the crypt wall opens onto a tunnel leading straight to the local pub. The official story: it was for monks to retrieve beer for funeral feasts. The villagers tell a different tale of a priest who needed liquid courage to face the things he heard scratching at the crypt door after dark. Whether practical or paranormal, these passages reveal a truth deeper than superstition. For medieval Europeans, death wasn't an end, but a change of address. The crypt doorway was the mailbox where the living could slip their prayers under the crack, hoping the departed might still be listening. What lingers today isn't just the chill of these spaces, but the uncanny sense that the silence itself is watching. Run your hand along the edges of a crypt door, and you might feel it, not just the cold of the stone, but the weight of centuries of whispered goodbyes, of fingers tracing those apotropaic marks one last time before stepping back into the light. These thresholds weren't just boundaries, they were conversations in stone, where every scratch, every narrowed arch, every enforced silence said the same thing. The dead may be gone, but the door between worlds was never fully closed. Alchemical doorways weren't just physical entrances, they were puzzles wrapped in mystery, their very designs whispering of forbidden knowledge. Picture a heavy oak door in the back of a Prague university, its surface inlaid with a celestial map of swirling brass and silver. To the untrained eye, it might look like decoration, but to an alchemist, those stars were a key. Line them up with the constellations on a specific night, and hidden gears would click, granting access to a chamber where the air smelled of sulfur and crushed herbs. These weren't mere rooms, they were sanctuaries where the lines between chemistry and incantation blurred into something transcendent. Take the legendary doorway of Cornelius Agrippa, tucked beneath his estate in Cologne. Carved into its lintel was a single phrase: Visita interiora terrae rectificando in vines occultum lapidem. Visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying you will find the hidden stone. At first glance, it reads like poetic nonsense, but rearrange the initials and they spell vitriol, the alchemical symbol for sulfuric acid. This wasn't just wordplay, it was a test. Only those who understood the language of symbols could pass. Behind such thresholds, experiments unfolded that would seem unthinkable today: flasks bubbling with mercury and antimony, furnaces burning at impossible temperatures, all in pursuit of transmutation. The irony: some of these failed experiments accidentally birthed modern chemistry. That vivid red glass staining medieval church windows, thank an alchemist's botched gold recipe for its crimson hue. The most intriguing doors, though, were the ones that seemed to defy physics. In the ruins of a Tuscan villa, archaeologists uncovered a doorway with no visible hinges or handles, just a smooth slab of black marble. After months of study, they discovered its secret: a series of hidden channels filled with liquid metal. When heated by a brazier at the base, the metal would expand, triggering counterweights that silently swung the door inward. Was it mere engineering, or was there ritual significance to using quicksilver, the same substance alchemists believed held the key to eternal life? The answer might lie in the villa's records, but here's the twist: those manuscripts were written in a cipher that rearranged letters based on phases of the moon. Even now, scholars are piecing together fragments, chasing the ghost of a man who built his doorway to be as elusive as his art. What's haunting is how these thresholds mirror the alchemist's own obsessions. Just as they sought to transform lead into gold, their doorways were exercises in metamorphosis, stone becoming puzzle, wood becoming code, iron becoming a sentinel that judged who was worthy to cross. Perhaps that's why so many of these portals survive while their secrets don't. They were never meant to be solved by the uninitiated. Even today, running a hand over their weathered surfaces, you can almost feel the echo of a question. Do you truly wish to know what lies beyond? Some doors, it seems, guard their mysteries as fiercely as they did 5 centuries ago. The Templars didn't just build doorways, they engineered illusions. Walk through Tama Castle's unassuming arch, and you'd never guess the stones beneath your feet conceal a shaft dropping straight into a network of tunnels wide enough for 2 knights to pass abreast in full armor. These weren't mere escape routes, they were theatrical feats designed to disorient. Some corridors ended abruptly in blank walls, while others curved just enough to exploit torchlight's flicker, making pursuers swear the passage ahead had vanished. But the real genius lay in the twin pillars flanking certain thresholds, a deliberate echo of Solomon's temple's bows and Jachin columns. Historians still debate whether these were spiritual homages or practical markers. Press the right carved vine on the left pillar, and a section of wall would pivot, revealing a spiral stair descending to chambers where the air still smells of beeswax from long-burned candles. Portugal's sunrise-aligned doorway is no accident of architecture. On the summer solstice, light pierces its slit like a blade, striking a single rusted iron hook on the far wall. For years, this was dismissed as decorative until someone noticed the hook's shadow at noon that same day, traced the exact contours of a Templar cross etched into the floor. Was it a calendar, a ritual marker, or something more pragmatic? In Cyprus's Colossi Castle, a similar doorway channels wind into a haunting whistle on stormy nights, a phenomenon locals once believed was the voices of fallen knights chanting. The truth might be simpler, acoustic engineering to mask clandestine meetings. Then there are the doors that refuse to stay, found beneath Malta's Fort St. Angelo, a passage documented in 15th century ledgers, was walled up during renovations only for workers to rediscover it 50 years later, intact behind the bricks, with fresh candle wax pooled in niches no one could have reached. Even stranger are the blind thresholds in French commanderies, door-shaped recesses with no actual opening. Some speculate these were symbolic portals for spiritual journeys, while treasure hunters insist they're clues to vaults hidden behind false masonry. The most compelling evidence lies in Rennes-le-Château, where a doorway's keystone bears a cipher that, when deciphered, points to another door half a mile away, which itself leads nowhere. What chills modern researchers isn't just the Templars' skill at concealment, but their understanding of human psychology. A doorway slightly narrower than standard forces intruders to turn sideways, slowing them just enough for defenders to strike. A lintel carved with overlapping circles, harmless decoration to most, could be a coded map to those initiated in sacred geometry. Even the act of passing through held layered meaning. Initiates reportedly entered new chambers backward, symbolically dying to their old selves as they crossed. The true legacy of these portals isn't in the gold or relics they may hide, but in the way they redefine boundaries. For the Templars, a doorway wasn't just wood and iron. It was a test, a parable, and sometimes a weapon. Today, when you stand before one of their surviving thresholds, you're not just looking at history. You're standing at the edge of a labyrinth of minds who believed that some truth should only be found by those willing to search in the dark. Standing before the towering doorways of Chartres or Reims Cathedral, you're not just looking at stone. You're standing inside a living manuscript, one where every vine, every angel's wing, every saint's outstretched hand was carved with purpose. These portals were the medieval equivalent of a stained glass Wikipedia, compressing entire gospels into sculpted narratives that even a child could understand. Take the famous royal portal at Chartres. Its 3 doorways form a triptych, each jammed with elongated figures, kings and queens of Judah, their robes cascading like frozen waterfalls. But look closer, their faces aren't stern, they smile faintly as if sharing an inside joke with the heavens. This was intentional. To illiterate peasants, these weren't just statues, they were welcoming hosts, beckoning them into sacred space with expressions that said, "You belong here too." The real storytelling happens above the doors in the semicircular tympanum. At Vézelay Abbey, Christ doesn't just sit in judgment, he explodes outward in a radiating mandala of light, his fingers stretching to touch the edges of the cosmos while apostles below twist to witness the spectacle. The message was visceral: step through this doorway and you're stepping into divine drama. Even the framing archivolts held meaning. Those concentric rings of carved foliage and stars weren't decoration, they mapped the medieval universe, with earth at the threshold and heaven arcing overhead like a stone rainbow. But some carvings were designed to unsettle. The south portal of Bourges Cathedral features a helmet so vivid you can almost hear screams, a gaping beast's jaws swallowing sinners while demons gleefully prod them with pitchforks. Directly opposite, the blessed ascend orderly stairs to paradise, their faces serene. This wasn't just fire and brimstone theater, it was spiritual cartography. A medieval villager could glance between the 2 scenes and think, that's the path I want, and the one I'll avoid. The genius of these doorways lies in their layered literacy. To the educated, the jam statue's attributes a key for Peter, a lion for Jerome were theological footnotes. To the poor, their sheer grandeur conveyed holiness through awe. Even the act of passing through held symbolism. Many portals were staggered, forcing worshippers to turn sideways momentarily, a physical echo of repentance, shedding worldly concerns like a coat before entering. Today, running your fingers over these carvings, you're touching more than artistry. You're tracing the grooves of a lost language, one that spoke in sunlight and shadow, where a curled demon's tale could preach louder than any sermon. These stones were never meant to be silent. They were built to hum with stories, waiting for someone to pause, look up, and listen. The hermit's doorway was never grand, just a crack in the rock, a weathered plank wedged between boulders, or a hollowed-out oak barely tall enough to kneel in. Yet these humble openings held a power far beyond their size. Step inside one, and you'd find a space so small your breath would fog the walls, where a single candle's glow could fill the entire room. This was intentional. Medieval hermits believed the path to divinity wasn't through soaring cathedrals, but in compression, the body folded in prayer, the world whittled down to the scrape of a quill on parchment or the slow drip of water down a cave wall. Their doorways weren't just entrances, they were sieves, straining out the noise of the world until only silence remained. Some of these thresholds tell silent stories. In the cliffs of Italy's Val dei Templi, a hermitage door faces a sheer drop, its wooden frame wedged into the rock like an afterthought. Below, the valley sprawls in all its beauty: olive groves, distant villages, the glint of a river. But the hermit who lived here would have seen none of it. His doorway opened inward toward a niche just deep enough to lie down in, where the only view was a crude cross scratched into the stone. Others, like the tree trunk hermitages of Poland's Białowieża forest, blended so seamlessly with nature that travelers might pass within inches and never notice them. These weren't homes, they were hideouts from humanity, where the only knock on the door would be the tap of a woodpecker or the wind rattling the leaves. Then there were the leper squints, those heartbreaking slits carved beside hermitage doors, no wider than a hand's breadth. Through these, the sick and outcast could whisper confessions or receive communion on the end of a long spoon, their faces veiled in shadow. In Cornwall's St. Gavin Chapel, the squint aligns perfectly with the morning sun on the winter solstice, flooding the dark interior with light for a few precious minutes. Was it practical, giving lepers a glimpse of dawn they couldn't step outside to see, or symbolic, a reminder that even the most forsaken souls weren't beyond redemption? The answer might lie in the grooves worn into the stone beneath these windows, where generations of fingers gripped the ledge as they waited for a voice from the other side. What's haunting is how these doorways invert our modern obsession with connection. Today, we build homes with ever larger windows, as if to say, "Look at me, I exist." The hermit did the opposite. His doorway was a refusal, a rejection of the world's gaze. Yet in that refusal, he found something few of us ever will, a silence so complete it became its own kind of voice. Run your palm along the edge of one of these thresholds, and you'll feel it, not just the smoothness left by countless passing robes, but the weight of a choice most of us would never dare make. To step through that door wasn't just to leave the world behind. It was to vanish into something vaster, where even the echo of your own breath felt like an intrusion. Perhaps that's why these tiny portals still draw pilgrims centuries later. They aren't just relics, they're mirrors. Stand before one long enough, and you start to wonder, what would it take for you to cross that threshold? What would you need to leave outside, and what might you find in the silence if you dared to listen? Pilgrimage doorways were never just stops along a route, they were living metaphors, each threshold whispering the same question. Who were you when you arrived, and who will you become when you leave? Take the Puerta del Perdón at the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. Its massive oak planks, blackened by centuries of candle smoke, bore witness to a ritual as old as the Camino itself. Pilgrims would kneel before crossing, their foreheads pressing into the same stone where countless others had left behind guilt like shed skin. The act was visceral. Stepping through wasn't just about entering a church. It was about stepping into a new version of yourself, scrubbed raw by miles of blisters and prayer. Not all pilgrimage doors were so solemn. In Italy's Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, the holy door sparkled with mosaics of angels mid-flight, their gold tiles catching the light as if to say redemption could be radiant. Opened only during Jubilee years, this portal drew crowds so vast that witnesses wrote of nobles and beggars pressed shoulder to shoulder, united by the promise that passing through would shave years off their purgatory. The door itself became a kind of time machine, one where the currency wasn't coins but contrition, but the real magic lay in the smaller, quieter thresholds. Along the Via Francigena, weary travelers would encounter unassuming chapels with doors painted a particular shade of blue, a color medieval artists reserved for Mary's cloak. To medieval eyes, that hue wasn't just pigment. It was a visual embrace, a mother's whisper that the hardest miles were behind them. Other doorways played tricks with perception. The Abbey of Conques in France built its pilgrim entrance at a slight incline, forcing arrivals to ascend even as they stepped inside, a physical echo of the spiritual climb they'd undertaken. Some portals held darker legends. The blood door of Wittenberg's Castle Church, where Martin Luther allegedly nailed his 95 Theses, was said to ooze a rusty residue during storms, as if the wood itself remembered the fractures it symbolized. In contrast, Portugal's Bom Jesus do Monte Sanctuary offered a staircase of doorways, each representing a biblical station of the cross. Pilgrims would pause at every landing, their progress marked not by distance, but by the slow unfolding of sacred story. What's striking isn't just the variety of these thresholds, but their shared understanding of movement as transformation. Whether it was the glittering holy door or a simple farmhouse entrance marked with a scallop shell, the Camino symbol, each recognized that every journey changes the traveler, and sometimes the only way to move forward is to walk through something. Today, when modern pilgrims trace these ancient routes, they're following more than paths. They're stepping into a conversation between stone and soul, where every doorway asks, "Are you ready to leave your old self behind?" The answer, of course, is written in the footprints leading away from the threshold, lighter, perhaps, than the ones that approached it. The color black has always held a strange power over the human imagination, not just an absence of light, but a presence all its own. In the misty glens of Scotland and the windswept cliffs of Ireland, certain doorways wore this shade like armor, their pitch-dark surfaces standing stark against the stone or timber of the house. These weren't mere aesthetic choices. A black door was a signal, a boundary, and sometimes a weapon. In the Hebrides, it was said that painting your door black could confuse malevolent spirits, making them mistake the entrance for a bottomless pit. But the real genius lay in the dual meaning. What repelled evil could also mark a house in mourning, a visual cue to neighbors that grief lived within. Not all black doors were created equal. Some bore hidden symbols scratched into the paint, a crescent moon for protection, a row of dots to represent the Pleiades, believed to guide lost souls away. Others had thresholds sprinkled with iron filings, a metal thought to burn the feet of fairies who might try to cross. The most feared were the cursing doors of Ulster, where families engaged in blood feuds would deliberately blacken their entrances, daring their enemies to step through and risk the malocchio, the evil eye. Superstition held that crossing such a threshold uninvited could summon a curse so potent it would cling to your bloodline for generations. Venice's Porta Nera took this symbolism to chilling extremes. During the plague years, this unassuming door near the Fondamenta Nuovo became a grim landmark. Victims were carried through its arch not for healing, but for transport to the quarantine island of Poveglia, a one-way journey. The door's black paint wasn't just practical camouflage for stains, it was psychological warfare. Citizens knew to give it a wide berth, their superstitions doing the work of any official quarantine. Even today, locals swear the wood still smells faintly of vinegar and burnt herbs, remnants of desperate attempts to purify what passed through. What's fascinating is how these doorways played with perception. In dim light, a black door seems to recede, creating the illusion of depth, a visual trick that may have fed legends of portals to the underworld. Some Irish cottages took advantage of this, positioning black doors opposite mirrors so that approaching visitors would see their own reflection seemingly floating in darkness, a subtle reminder that crossing this threshold meant entering someone else's world, their rules. Yet for all their foreboding, black doors could also be liberators. In the Scottish Highlands, certain families believed that passing through one after a betrayal or injustice would reset your fate, the darkness scrubbing away ill luck like a spiritual eraser. The ritual was precise. You had to enter backward at midnight, your left hand clutching a sprig of rowan, the tree sacred to protection. Whether it worked or not hardly mattered. The act itself was a psychological fresh start, the door less a barrier than a baptism. Today, when you encounter one of these surviving thresholds, their paint cracked with age, you're facing more than just weathered wood. You're standing at the intersection of fear and hope, where a coat of pigment could mean safety or sorrow depending on which side you stood. The black door didn't just mark a boundary, it asked a question. Are you brave enough to cross into the unknown, knowing some stains, like some stories, never truly wash away? Romanesque doorways didn't just stand, they loomed. Picture a massive semicircular arch, its stones so thick you'd swear they were carved from the earth itself, flanked by columns stout enough to withstand a siege. These weren't just entrances, they were declarations of permanence, their rounded forms echoing the barrel vaults of ancient Rome. Step through one, and you'd feel the weight of the divine pressing down on you, the darkness inside broken only by slivers of light from narrow windows. This was architecture as theology, God as an unshakable fortress, his presence heavy and immediate. The carvings on these doorways drove the point home, stern figures of Christ in majesty, his hand raised in judgment, surrounded by the symbols of the evangelists like a celestial courtroom. Every element was designed to humble, to remind the worshipper they stood at the threshold of something vast and unyielding. Then came the Gothic Revolution, and with it, doorways that didn't just reach for the sky, they dissolved into it. Gone were the squat, muscular arches. In their place rose-pointed peaks that seemed to pull heaven itself downward. Light, once rationed in thin shafts, now flooded through stained glass, transforming the entrance into a kaleidoscope of color. Where Romanesque portals had warned of judgment, Gothic ones invited wonder. The tympanum sculptures shifted too. Christ no longer loomed as a distant judge, but extended his hands in benediction, his face softer, almost approachable. Even the supporting columns changed, elongating into slender clusters that made stone seem weightless, as if the very walls were straining upward in prayer. The difference wasn't just stylistic, it was philosophical. Romanesque architecture spoke of a world where faith was armor, where the church was a refuge against chaos. Gothic design whispered of a universe charged with divine light, where grace could pierce the mundane like sunlight through glass. Look closely at the moldings around a Gothic doorway, and you'll find them crawling with foliage so delicate it seems to quiver in an unseen breeze, a far cry from the geometric precision of Romanesque carvings. This was nature sanctified, a reminder that the sacred wasn't just above, but woven into the very fabric of creation. Yet for all their differences, these doorways shared a secret language. Both used symbolism to guide the faithful. Romanesque with its labyrinthine spirals hinting at life's twists, Gothic with its flamboyant tracery mapping celestial hierarchies. And both understood the power of procession, the way a doorway could choreograph movement, slowing pilgrims with steps worn concave by centuries of knees, or hurrying them forward with a crescendo of light. Even the materials told a story. Romanesque builders favored local stone, its roughness a testament to earthly toil. Gothic architects shipped limestone from distant quarries, its pale purity a metaphor for transcendence. What's haunting is how these thresholds capture a civilization in flux. Stand between a Romanesque and Gothic doorway, and you're not just seeing two styles, you're witnessing the moment medieval Europe tilted its gaze from earth to heaven. The stones themselves seem to argue, one voice growling of fire and brimstone, the other singing of radiance and revelation, and perhaps that's the real magic. These doorways weren't just passages, they were conversations across time, where every arch, every carving, every shaft of light asked the same question in 100 different ways. What do you believe is waiting on the other side? The Alhambra's doorways don't just open, they perform illusions. Step through the Puerta del Vino, and suddenly the world shifts. Your path bends, your reflection fractures in a dozen mirrored tiles, and the air hums with the scent of orange blossoms from a courtyard you can't yet see. This was no accident. Moorish architects designed these portals as sensory labyrinths, where every twist served a purpose. Take the famed bent entrance of the Puerta de la Justicia. Its zigzag passage wasn't just defensive, it was psychological theater. Invaders would barrel in, only to find themselves abruptly turned, their momentum broken, their swords clattering against walls suddenly too close. Meanwhile, defenders watched unseen from muqarnas-clad galleries above. their view framed by those star-shaped perforations that scattered sunlight like celestial confetti. But the real magic lies in the details most visitors miss. Run your fingers along the stucco carvings flanking any Alhambra doorway, and you'll feel something extraordinary. The patterns aren't flat. They ripple outward in layers, each arabesque peeling away like the petals of a stone flower. This was sacred geometry made tactile, a tactile reminder that Allah's creation unfolded in infinite dimensions. Even the colors whispered secrets. The famed red plaster wasn't just decorative, it contained crushed brick dust, a material believed to repel evil spirits with its earthly warmth. And those tiny glazed tiles, their cobalt blue came from lapis lazuli imported along silk routes, each fragment a frozen piece of distant sky embedded in the walls. Some thresholds held darker mysteries. Behind a nondescript door in the Comer's Tower, a narrow stairwell descends to a chamber with acoustics so precise. A whisper at one end travels clearly to the other, a medieval surveillance system where even the walls had ears. Other passages seem to defy physics entirely. The Court of the Lions surrounding arcades feature doors that appear identical, yet some open to sun-drenched gardens while others lead to bathing pools where the water never stops murmuring, its underground channels still functioning after 7 centuries. What's most haunting isn't the craftsmanship but the intent. These doorways weren't just built, they were composed like stanzas in a poem about power and paradise. The Moors understood something modern architects often forget, that a threshold should be a story. Cross one, and you're stepping into a tale where mathematics becomes melody, where defense dissolves into decoration, where every arch is both a shield and a smile. Even now, standing in their shadow, you can almost hear the rustle of silk robes and the click of ivory chess pieces from some long-vanished council, echoes of a world where beauty and cunning shared the same keyhole. Celtic doorways weren't just entrances, they were negotiations with the unseen. In the misty glens of Ireland and the rugged hills of Wales, certain stones held whispers of the otherworld, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. Take the Clachon, those beehive huts with doorways so low even a child had to stoop. This wasn't poor engineering, it was deliberate ceremony. To enter meant bowing, not just to the physical space, but to the spirits believed to watch from the shadows. The Celts understood something modern architects often forget. A threshold isn't just a boundary, it's a conversation. Some doorways held even stranger secrets. Along the Burren's limestone pavements, tiny, fairy doors, no taller than a handspan, still dot the landscape, miniature arches carved into boulders or tucked beneath tree roots. These weren't whimsy, they were diplomacy. Offerings of milk, bread, or polished stones would be left in these openings, a pact with the Owl's She, the fairy folk who guarded the land's hidden energies. Cross a farmer who neglected these rituals, and you'd hear tales of cows drying up overnight or fences collapsing without wind. The message was clear: respect the threshold or face the consequences. Then there were the sacred wells, their stone surrounds often featuring lunula carvings, crescent moons symbolizing the thin veil between worlds. Pilgrims would circle these wells 3 times before entering, their footsteps tracing patterns older than memory. The doorways here weren't always physical. Sometimes the threshold was the water itself. Drop a coin into its depths, and you weren't just making a wish, you were paying the ferryman for safe passage into the realm of prayers. What's haunting is how these beliefs persist. Modern homeowners in County Kerry still consult with fairy doctors before moving boulders, fearing they might unknowingly block an ancient path. In Pembrokeshire, farmers leave the oldest trees in their hedgerows untouched, their gnarled roots marking doorways no human should disturb. These aren't superstitions, they're echoes of a world where every hillock and stream pulsed with life, where the landscape itself was a living manuscript written in stone and moss. Perhaps that's why Celtic doorways feel different under your fingertips. Run your hand along the lintel of a clochon, and you're not just touching rock, you're brushing against the edge of a belief system that saw portals in the crook of a branch or the bend of a river. These thresholds didn't just separate inside from outside. They whispered that the world was far stranger, far more alive than we've been taught to see. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough at dusk, you might still hear the faintest echo of that truth, carried on the wind like a half-remembered song. The Devil's Door wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning carved in wood and stone. Picture this, a small, unassuming doorway tucked into the north wall of an English parish church, its hinges rusted shut, its lintels scratched with faint symbols that look less like decoration and more like frantic claw marks. This was no ordinary entrance. Medieval congregations believed evil needed an exit strategy, literally. Leaving one door perpetually unlocked wasn't carelessness, it was spiritual crowd control. The logic was chillingly practical. If the devil couldn't escape, he'd linger inside, whispering heresies into the ears of the faithful. Better to let him slip out quietly, taking his curses with him like a thief in the night. Some of these doors hid darker secrets. In the village of Longborough, a Devil's Door bears a peculiar feature. Its threshold slopes downward, as if coaxing something to leave and never return. Local records speak of a vicar who, in the 1500s, ordered the door sealed after hearing laughter echo from behind it during a baptism. When workmen pried it open centuries later, they found the skeleton of a hare wedged beneath the sill, its skull crushed, a folk charm meant to trap evil spirits in animal form. Elsewhere, like at St. Michael's in Warwickshire, the door's keyhole was deliberately misaligned with the lock, a physical metaphor for the devil's distorted promises. But not all devil's doors were about banishment. Some served as grim reminders. In France's Auvergne region, certain church portals were painted blood red and carved with inverted crosses, not to welcome evil, but to mock it, a medieval version of hanging a wanted poster. The most haunting examples, though, are the ones that played on human weakness. The Devil's Isle in Germany's Quedlinburg Abbey features a doorway just wide enough for a single person to squeeze through sideways. Passing through required pressing against a relief of the Last Judgment, its damned souls writhing underfoot. The message was clear: temptation might look like an open door, but the price of stepping through was etched in screaming stone. What's fascinating is how these thresholds blurred the line between superstition and psychology. A permanently unlocked door wasn't just about the supernatural, it was about control. By giving evil a designated exit, communities transformed their fear into something manageable, a negotiation with the unknown. Even the choice of the north side was symbolic. Medieval Christians associated north with coldness and darkness, the direction where the sun never shone. Placing the Devil's Door there was like assigning evil its own celestial waiting room. Today, when you find one of these sealed-up portals, their outlines still visible in the church walls, you're touching more than history. You're touching the fingerprints of an era that believed the spiritual world was as real as the stone beneath their feet, and that sometimes the best way to keep the darkness out was to leave it a way to leave. The Devil's Door wasn't just architecture, it was a confession. Even in their holiest spaces, our ancestors knew evil didn't always knock. Sometimes it needed a door left slightly ajar. Renaissance doorways didn't just welcome visitors, they announced a revolution. Where medieval arches had bowed under the weight of divine judgment, these new thresholds stood tall. their lintels carved with faces that laughed, wept, and pondered with startling humanity. Take Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise in Florence, where bronze panels shimmered with scenes from Genesis, each figure so lifelike you could almost hear the rustle of their robes. This wasn't just art, it was a manifesto. For the first time, biblical heroes stood not as stiff icons, but as flesh and blood beings, their muscles straining, their faces etched with grief or triumph. The doorway itself became a stage, its frames edged with acanthus leaves so finely wrought they seemed to tremble in the breeze, a deliberate echo of Rome's long-lost glory, resurrected by human hands. But the real rebellion lay in the details. Peer closely at the corners of Renaissance doorways, and you might spot a cheeky self-portrait of the artist, tucked among the saints like a hidden signature. On Venice's Palazzo Ducale, a sculptor carved his own likeness into the keystone, grinning down at passers-by as if to say, "I did this." Even the materials whispered of human ambition. Architects abandoned the rough local stone of the Middle Ages, importing marble from Carrara at staggering cost, its creamy veins proof that beauty was worth the effort. The message was clear: divinity hadn't diminished, but humanity had grown taller. Some thresholds played slyer games. In Rome's Palazzo della Cancelleria, a doorway's pediment hides an optical illusion. Stand too close, and the classical figures seem disjointed. Step back, and they snap into perfect harmony. It was a visual pun on Renaissance ideals, truth revealed through perspective, both artistic and philosophical. Others, like the portal of Urbino's ducal palace, staged quiet dramas in their carvings. Here, a knight's foot subtly crushes a grotesque mask underfoot, a metaphor for reason triumphing over superstition. These weren't just decorations, they were arguments in stone, each chisel stroke debating what it meant to be human. What's haunting is how these doorways mirror the era's tensions. For all their celebration of individuality, many were commissioned by the very powers they seemed to challenge: bankers and popes who wanted their names etched into eternity. The Porta del Paradiso itself, for all its heavenly scenes, was funded by Florence's wool guild, its gold leaf paid for by the sweat of weavers. Perhaps that's the true genius of these thresholds. They didn't just mark a shift from divine to human, but captured the messy, glorious contradiction of an age that could worship both God and genius in the same breath. Today, running your fingers over these carvings, you're touching more than skill. You're tracing the moment Europe dared to frame its doorways not as passages to the next world, but as monuments to this one. The stone remembers. Press your ear close enough, and you might still hear it, the echo of 1,000 artisans whispering, "Look what we can do." Baroque architects didn't just design doorways, they orchestrated experiences. Imagine approaching a palace entrance where every element conspires to take your breath away. Twisted Solomonic columns writhing upward like frozen flames, pediments broken open to reveal cascading stone drapery, and gilded sunbursts so radiant they seem to pulse with divine light. This wasn't mere decoration, it was psychological theater. Take the doorway framing Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa in Rome's Santa Maria della Vittoria. The sculpture itself is transcendent, but the arch around it elevates the scene into pure spectacle. Carved marble clouds spill from the tympanum, gilt rays pierce the shadows, and hidden windows bathe the space in a celestial glow, all carefully calculated to make viewers feel they'd stumbled into a miraculous vision rather than a church alcove. The Baroque obsession with sensory overload extended to sound. At Versailles, the ambassador's staircase featured a doorway with a parabolic arch designed to amplify footsteps. As dignitaries ascended, the click of their heels echoed unnaturally loud, lending their approach the gravitas of a drumroll. Other thresholds played with shadow in equally cunning ways. The Palazzo Barberini's main entrance curves inward slightly, creating pockets of darkness that make the central crest seem to float mid-air, a trick of perspective that left visitors questioning their eyes. Even the materials had hidden agendas. Architects mixed powdered glass into stucco to make surfaces shimmer under candlelight, ensuring evening receptions felt like stepping into a living jewel box. What's fascinating is how these doorways blurred sacred and secular power. The same techniques that glorified saints' dramatic lighting, forced perspective, kinetic energy in stone were used to exalt kings. In Vienna's Belvedere Palace, Prince Eugene's doorway features Hercules wrestling a lion, the hero's muscles straining just enough to remind guests of their host's military might. Meanwhile, ecclesiastical portals like those in Salzburg Cathedral doubled as spiritual propaganda, their swirling forms pulling the eye heavenward while subtly reinforcing church authority. Yet for all their grandeur, Baroque thresholds held intimate secrets, some concealed, whispering corners where confessors could overhear penitents' murmurs through acoustically aligned vaults. Others, like the hidden door in Prague's Wallenstein Palace, pivoted on silent hinges to reveal surprise gardens, a reminder that even in an age of excess, delight often lay in the reveal. The true genius of these doorways wasn't their opulence, but their emotional precision. Run your hand along their curves today, and you'll feel more than cold marble. You'll trace the fingerprints of artists who understood that awe isn't just seen, it's staged, rehearsed, and etched into the very air around us. These weren't passages, they were portals to a world where reality itself could be sculpted into something grander, if only for the length of a held breath. Neoclassical architects didn't just borrow from antiquity, they distilled it into a language of power and precision. Where Baroque doorways had dripped with ornament, these new thresholds stood stripped to their essence, fluted columns marching in perfect formation, crisp pediments resting like geometric crowns, and surfaces so smooth they seemed carved by mathematical certainty rather than human hands. The Brandenburg Gate wasn't just a monument, it was a mirror held up to an age obsessed with order. Its 6 Doric columns, unadorned by scrolls or foliage, spoke louder than any flourish. Here was a gateway that didn't whisper of divine mysteries but proclaimed human sovereignty over space and stone. Yet beneath this apparent simplicity lay cunning subversions. Look closely at the gate's quadriga statue crowning the structure. The goddess Victoria's chariot isn't static but mid-motion, her horse's manes frozen as if caught in a sudden breeze. This was the neoclassical paradox. Even as architects worshipped symmetry, they smuggled in life. The same tension pulsed through doorways across Europe. Paris's Pantheon, with its soaring Corinthian columns, might seem austere at first glance, until you notice the frieze above its entrance, where France's revolutionary heroes mingle with Roman senators, a visual manifesto that linked modern ideals to ancient lineage. The true genius of these thresholds was their coded diplomacy. In London's Somerset House, the Admiralty doorway featured a globe flanked by figures of navigation and astronomy, a quiet assertion of Britain's imperial reach disguised as scholarly pursuit. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello embedded a subtler revolution in its entrance. The front door's pediment was exactly half the height of the dome behind it, a deliberate ratio echoing the balance between individual liberty and collective governance. Every element was calibrated, from the spacing between columns wide enough to suggest openness, narrow enough to imply security, to the choice of allegorical figures. Wisdom might hold a book, but her sandaled foot often rested on a serpent reason triumphing over chaos in a single, silent gesture. What's haunting is how these doorways became battlegrounds for competing visions. After Napoleon's fall, the Arc de Triomphe's designers debated whether its allegories should celebrate military glory or civic virtue. a dispute etched into the final carvings, where winged victories hover uneasily beside stoic personifications of law. Even the materials told conflicted stories. While white marble screamed purity, many neoclassical buildings were secretly brick beneath their stucco skins, a metaphor for the era's struggle to reconcile democratic ideals with the messy realities of power. Today, running a hand along these chiseled surfaces, you're touching more than stone. You're tracing the contours of an age that believed geometry could shape destiny, that a doorway wasn't just an entrance but a lens through which society might glimpse its better self. The columns stand as they always have, straight, proud, immovable, but the shadows they cast keep shifting, stretching across centuries to ask a question we're still answering. Can order ever truly contain the human spirit? The marble, of course, stays silent. It knows we'll keep stepping through to find out. Romanticism's ruined doorways weren't accidents, they were deliberate invitations to dream. Where neoclassical architects had prized crisp lines and mathematical precision, the Romantics worshipped the way ivy split stone, how a broken arch framed a storm cloud, or why moss creeping across a threshold felt more sacred than polished marble. Take Caspar David Friedrich's Abbey in the oak forest. The painting's skeletal Gothic doorway stands jagged against a twilight sky, its emptiness not a failure but a provocation. To Friedrich, ruin wasn't decay, it was the universe whispering secrets only the sensitive could hear. These fragments became altars where time itself was the deity, and every cracked lintel a hymn to impermanence. Wealthy landowners caught the fever. Across England and Germany, gardens sprouted, farley, doorways, carefully constructed ruins with no purpose but to stir the soul. The Earl of Dunmore built one framing a loch in Scotland, its sandstone blocks artfully tumbled as if some medieval chapel had surrendered to the mist. The trick: masons used acid to age the stone and buried nails in the mortar to rust theatrically. These weren't lies, they were stage sets for an emotional performance where visitors could play act as wanderers discovering lost civilizations. Even the planting was choreographed. Wild roses twined through fake cracks, and night-blooming flowers perfumed the air near moonlit thresholds, turning a stroll into a scene from a Byron poem. What's striking isn't just the artifice, but the psychology behind it. In an era of industrial upheaval, these ruins offered controlled melancholy, a way to mourn progress without rejecting it. A crumbling garden doorway let you sigh over vanished glories while your carriage waited just out of sight. The Romantics understood something modern life often forgets: beauty doesn't always live in wholeness. Sometimes it's the splintered edge of a threshold, the way a shadow pools in a missing keystone, or how a doorframe leading nowhere makes the horizon feel infinite. The most haunting examples weren't fabricated, though. In Sicily's Valley of the Temples, a solitary Greek arch stands bisected by time, its remaining half framing Mount Atlas like a celestial doorway. Poets wrote of passing through it to meet ghosts. Painters couldn't resist its asymmetry, but the real magic lies in what it does to visitors today. Without realizing why, people slow their steps as they approach, voices dropping to whispers. That's the power of a ruin. It doesn't just mark where a door once was. It becomes a mirror asking each passerby, what will remain of you when the ivy takes over? The stones, of course, don't answer. They just keep crumbling, turning history into something you can feel in your bones. Modern doorways have shed their medieval weight, but they still pulse with mystery, just in ways our ancestors wouldn't recognize. Take the sleek glass thresholds of corporate atriums, where reflections warp and multiply as you pass through, turning every entrance into a hall of mirrors. These aren't just functional transitions, they're psychological experiments playing with our perception of space and self. Or consider the disappearing doors. In some Tokyo apartments, sliding panels of frosted glass that dissolve into walls, erasing the line between rooms until you're navigating a labyrinth of light and shadow. Contemporary architects have traded stone and oak for steel and LED, but the essential question remains: what does it mean to cross from one world to another? Street artists like Banksy twist doorway symbolism into social commentary. His Door to Nowhere, a weathered wooden door floating mid-wall in a London alley, is more than a visual gag. It's a gut punch to urban neglect, a monument to neighborhoods where homes vanish overnight to make way for luxury condos. Nearby, an anonymous collective welded a functioning door to a bricked-up archway in Shoreditch, complete with a working knob and mail slot. For weeks, locals slipped letters through it addressed to the ghosts of the high street, turning a derelict space into a communal confessional. These aren't just art installations, they're modern-day apotropaic marks, warding off the demons of gentrification with humor and defiance. Then there are the doorways that exist purely to unsettle. James Turrell's light portals manipulate perception so masterfully that stepping through one feels less like entering a room and more like plunging into a pool of liquid sky. His Rodin Crater project frames celestial events with volcanic rock, transforming an Arizona cinder cone into a colossal sundial where doorways align with solstices. Ancient astronomy rebooted for the Instagram age. Meanwhile, in Reykjavik, a nondescript green door in a parking lot leads not to a storage closet but to Aurora, an underground bar where the ceiling shimmers with artificial northern lights. The thrill isn't just the speakeasy vibe, it's the jolt of realizing mystery didn't die with the Middle Ages. It just learned to wear new disguises. Perhaps the most telling evolution is in our own homes. Smart doors now greet us by name, their cameras scanning faces like electronic porters. But even here, the old magic lingers. Why else do we still pause at thresholds before entering a hospital room or a stranger's house? Why do realtors insist a front door's color affects a home's energy? We've swapped iron hinges for fingerprint scanners, but the doorway's primal power endures. It's still the moment where we steel ourselves, straighten our shoulders, and decide which version of ourselves walks through. The materials change, the human heartbeat at the threshold doesn't. As we close these ancient doorways behind us, their stones still whisper, their salt still stings, their silence still echoes. These thresholds are more than architecture, they're diaries of human fear, faith, and curiosity. Whether seeking gold, God, or ghosts, generations have crossed them, leaving traces we're only beginning to decipher. Next time you pass an old doorway, pause, listen. What stories might it hold? Share your own encounters with mysterious portals in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history's hidden corners. Until then, may your own thresholds be ever intriguing. But let's linger a moment longer, because the true magic of these portals isn't just in their history, but in how they continue to shape us. Think of the last time you hesitated before an unfamiliar door, your hand hovering over the knob. That flicker of anticipation, the slight tightening in your chest, it's the same instinct that made a medieval miner clutch his talisman before descending into the salt caves, or a monk trace a cross on his robes before entering the scriptorium. Doorways are where we rehearse our courage, where we decide whether to turn the key or walk away. And perhaps that's why these ancient thresholds still haunt us. They remind us that every entrance is also an exit, from safety, from certainty, from who we were before we stepped through. The alchemist's door coded with celestial secrets, the hermit's crooked plank wedged in a cliffside, the castle gate designed to humble invaders, they all ask the same question: what will you risk to cross? The answer changes with every era, but the tremor in our hands stays the same. So here's an invitation. The next time you encounter a doorway that gives you pause, whether it's the peeling paint of an abandoned farmhouse or the soaring arch of a cathedral, let it. Stand there until you feel it, the weight of all the footsteps that wore those stones smooth, the echoes of all the whispers that never quite faded. Then step through, not just as a visitor, but as the latest in a long line of seekers. Because history isn't just something we study, it's something we walk through, one threshold at a time, and with that, we'll leave these mysteries for now. But the past has a way of leaving its doors ajar. Who knows what we might find when we push them open next time? Until then, keep exploring, keep wondering, and above all, keep listening. The stones still have so much to say.